The scent of lemon oil and old paper was the only thing that felt real. I ran the soft cloth over the polished surface of his desk, my movements economical, silent. In this house, silence was currency. For 3 months, I had been a ghost in a dark blue uniform, learning the rhythms of the mansion on a hill overlooking Seoul. I learned the exact pressure required to close a door without it whispering shut, the precise angle to pour tea so it made no sound against the porcelain. I learned to be invisible. Mr. Kwan's study was the heart of his empire and the most forbidden room in the house. Yet, it was my responsibility. Black lacquer shelves held leather-bound books that were never opened. A floor-to-ceiling window framed the sprawling, indifferent city below. And on his desk, beside a stack of files with stark, red tabs, sat a single white orchid in a simple ceramic pot. It was perfect. Always. Except for today. A single, minuscule drop of darkness marred one of the pristine white petals. I leaned closer, my breath held tight in my chest. It wasn't ink. It was blood. Dark and already beginning to crust at the edges. My training, the voice of the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Han, screamed at me to ignore it. See nothing, know nothing. But my hands moved before my mind could object. With the edge of my dust cloth, I carefully, surgically, dabbed the speck of blood away. The petal was perfect again. I straightened up, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. That was when I felt it. The drop in temperature. The shift in the air that signaled his arrival. He moved like the room owed him space. Mr. Kwan didn't walk into his study. He consumed it. He was a man carved from shadows and discipline, always encased in a Tom Ford suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light. I kept my eyes down, fixed on the grain of the hardwood floor, my hands clasped behind my back. I could feel his gaze on me, a physical weight. He never spoke to me. In 3 months, he had not addressed a single word to me. His orders came through Mrs. Han. I was furniture that moved. He stopped at his desk. I heard the soft rustle of his jacket, the quiet click of a pen being set down. The silence stretched, becoming thin and sharp. I waited for him to dismiss me with a wave of his hand, as he always did. You will be required to stay late this evening. The voice was low, a gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It was so unexpected that for a moment I didn't realize he was speaking to me. I risked a glance up. He was watching me, his eyes dark and unreadable, his face a mask of cold neutrality. My own voice felt like a stranger in my throat, thin and reedy. Words tumbled out before I could stop them, a protest born of 3 months of saving and planning. Sir, I can't. A flicker of something, surprise? Annoyance? Crossed his features before being suppressed. No one told this man no. I knew that. The entire staff knew that. You did not refuse, Mr. Kwan. My courage was a flickering candle in a hurricane, but I held on to it. I have a date tonight, sir. I managed, the words feeling foolish and small in the oppressive quiet of the room. I need to leave at 6. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was heavy, filled with a sudden, predatory stillness. He didn't move a muscle, just stared at me. It felt like being studied under a microscope, every flaw, every fear laid bare. He was the most powerful man in Seoul's underworld, and I, a 20-year-old American girl working as his maid, had just told him I had better things to do. The absurdity of it was terrifying. He finally gave a slow, deliberate blink. We will see, he said. The words were not a promise or a negotiation. They were a judgment. Dismissed, I fled the room, my skin prickling with a sense of dread. For the rest of the afternoon, I worked with a frantic energy, scrubbing floors and polishing silver as if my life depended on it. Maybe it did. At 5:45, I was in the staff locker room, changing out of my uniform, my hands trembling as I pulled on a simple black dress. My date was with a kind university student named Jae-ho. We were going to see a movie. It was normal. It was a lifeline back to a world that made sense. The door opened. It was Mr. Park, Mr. Kwan's head of security. He was a block of a man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. Mr. Kwon requires your assistance this evening, he said, his voice flat. You will be serving dinner. My heart sank, but I told him. It is not a request, Chloe, he interrupted, using my name for the first time. The sound of it in his mouth was a warning. My date was a fantasy. My normal life was a million miles away. I was trapped. Dinner was not in the main dining hall. Mr. Park led me to a smaller, more private room in the West Wing, a place I had never been asked to clean. The table was set for two, but there was only one chair. The other was occupied by a man. He was bound to it with thick, black zip ties, his face a mess of bruises and sweat. A gag was tied loosely around his neck. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the doorway, a silver water pitcher shaking in my hand. Serve us, Mr. Kwon commanded from the head of the table. He was loosening his tie, the first sign of disorder I had ever seen on him. He looked at the terrified man in the chair with an air of profound boredom, as if this were just another tedious business meeting. I moved on autopilot, my feet feeling disconnected from my body. I poured Mr. Kwon a glass of water first, my hand miraculously steady. Then I approached the other man. His eyes, wide with terror, pleaded with me. Do something. Help me. But what could I do? I poured his water, the sound of it splashing into the glass unnervingly loud in the tense silence. I retreated to the wall, intending to make myself invisible again, but Mr. Kwon gestured to a stool in the corner. Stay. You might learn something. The interrogation was a masterclass in quiet violence. Mr. Kwon never raised his voice. He spoke calmly, dissecting the man's life with surgical precision. He knew the man's wife's name, the school his daughter attended, the name of the dog they had just bought. Each detail was a turn of the screw. The man, whose name was Lee, was from a rival family. He had been feeding information to them. You were at the Blue Pearl restaurant 2 years ago, Mr. Kwon stated. It wasn't a question. My family was there. A celebration. Lee began to sob thick, choked sounds. I was just a driver. I didn't know. You knew. Mr. Kwon cut him off, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than a shout. You watched them go inside. You gave the signal. And you drove away before the windows shattered. He leaned forward, the fabric of his expensive suit jacket tightening across his shoulders. You took Sohee from me. The name hung in the air, raw and painful. Lee shook his head frantically. It was an order. From inside your own organization. Your cousin. My cousin is dead, Mr. Kwon said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He paid for his betrayal. But the debt is not settled. The shame remains. He spoke of shame and honor like they were physical objects, debts of blood that could only be paid in kind. This was his wound. Not just the loss, but the failure to protect. The betrayal from his own blood. Sohee, his sister. The ghost that haunted these silent halls. The conversation, if it could be called that, devolved from there. The questions became sharper, the man's denials more frantic. I felt sick, a witness to a ritual I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to close my eyes, to disappear. Suddenly, Mr. Kwon's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and for the first time, his cold composure fractured. A muscle in his jaw clenched. He answered, listening intently for a moment before speaking in a low, urgent tone. How many? And how did they get past the gate? He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Mr. Park burst into the room, his hand on the gun holstered under his jacket. Sir, the east perimeter has been breached. They're on the grounds. The world tilted. Shouts erupted from outside, followed by the distinct, terrifying sound of automatic gunfire. In the sudden chaos, no one was looking at me. Lee was whimpering in his chair. Mr. Kwon and Mr. Park were already moving toward the door, issuing orders into their earpieces. This was my chance. The back stairs, the staff entrance, the woods beyond the garden wall, a map of escape flashed through my mind. I could be gone. I could run and never look back. My body tensed, ready to bolt. But my feet wouldn't move. I looked at the chaos unfolding, at the two men preparing for a battle inside their own home. And I thought of the name.
So he.
The girl he couldn't protect. My gaze fell on the heavy, ornate silver serving trolley against the wall. It was laden with covered dishes for a meal that would never be eaten. Without a conscious thought, I grabbed the largest, heaviest silver tray. It was ridiculously cumbersome, a pathetic weapon, but it was solid. It was something. I didn't run. I moved to the wall beside the doorway, flattening myself against it, my knuckles white around the rim of the tray. I chose to stay. The firefight was a blur of noise and violence that seemed to last an eternity and only a few seconds. I heard commands being shouted, the shattering of glass, the dull thud of bodies hitting the floor. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the heavy tray my only anchor in the storm. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The silence that descended was more deafening than the gunfire. It was filled with the smell of cordite and something metallic that I knew was blood. Footsteps approached the doorway. I tensed, raising the tray, ready to swing it with all my might. Mr. Kwan appeared in the doorway. He stopped short when he saw me. He was breathing heavily, his perfect suit was disheveled, and a dark, wet patch was spreading on the sleeve of his white shirt. His eyes, however, were sharp and focused. They took in my stance, my makeshift weapon, my terrified but determined expression. He said nothing. He simply walked over to me and gently took the silver tray from my hands. His fingers brushed against mine, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up my arm. The contact lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. He looked from the tray back to my face, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold command in his eyes. It was a flicker of something. A dangerous, unsettling curiosity. "Get the first aid kit from my bathroom," he said, his voice rough. It was an order, but it sounded different than before. The bathroom attached to his master suite was a cavern of black marble and chrome. It felt wrong to be in there, a violation of some unspoken rule. The space was intensely personal, scented with the faint, clean notes of cedar and something else, something like cold night air. I found the first aid kit under the sink and brought it back to him. He was sitting on the edge of his unmade bed, shrugging out of his ruined suit jacket. The wound was a deep graze along his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. "Can you do this?" he asked, his gaze locked on mine. "My mother was a nurse," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the truest thing I'd said all night. I opened the kit, my hands moving with a competence that surprised me. I cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, my touch gentle but firm. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. He just watched me, his stillness a palpable force in the room. The proximity was suffocating. I was intensely aware of the warmth radiating from his skin, the flex of muscle in his arm under my fingers, the way the light caught the single silver ring he wore on his little finger. To distract myself, I focused on the task, applying a sterile dressing and wrapping it with clean gauze. "You are not afraid," he stated, his voice a low rumble. I didn't look up from my work, securing the tape on the bandage. "I'm terrified," I admitted, the confession raw and honest. "But I am not useless." I finally met his eyes. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the violence from moments before. He was looking at me as if he'd never truly seen me before. Not as a maid, not as a piece of furniture that moved, but as something else. That was the moment everything changed. He held my gaze for a long beat, and then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. In the days that followed, a new, unspoken arrangement settled over the house. I was no longer just a maid. Mrs. Han stopped giving me menial tasks, instead assigning me to his study, to his suites, exclusively. I was in his space constantly, a silent shadow in his orbit. He never mentioned the attack, or the man tied to the chair, who had vanished as if he'd never existed. But the event lingered between us, an invisible thread connecting that night to every silent moment that followed. One evening, while he was out at a meeting, I was dusting the bookshelves in his study. My hand brushed against a carved wooden panel that felt slightly loose. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in this house, got the better of me. I pressed it. With a soft click, a hidden compartment swung open. Inside was a single, thin manila folder. My name, Chloe Davis, was typed neatly on the tab. My blood turned to ice. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. It was a complete dossier. A copy of my birth certificate, my high school transcripts, my mother's hospital records. It detailed the mountain of medical debt she'd left behind when she died, the reason I'd dropped out of college. It had information on my younger brother, Caleb, his school, his friends, his part-time job. He knew everything. He had known everything from the very beginning. This job hadn't been a random opportunity. I had been chosen, vetted, my desperation a qualification on my resume. The illusion of choice, of having any control over my life, shattered. I felt a wave of nausea. I should run. This was not a cage with a door I could choose not to see. This was a meticulously constructed prison, and I had walked into it willingly. I shoved the file back, my mind racing. Run where? He knew about Caleb. He knew where to find him. Was that information a safety measure or a threat? The answer came 2 nights later. He returned late, storming into the study where I was organizing his papers. His control, the iron mask he always wore, was gone. In its place was a cold, restrained fury that was more terrifying than any shouting rage. He threw a file onto the desk. It wasn't mine. It was filled with surveillance photos. Pictures of the bus stop I used to use before moving into the staff quarters. Pictures of 2 men in a parked car, watching it. "Did you think I would let you walk into that?" He bit out, his voice ablade. "Did you think for 1 second your safety was not my concern?" I stared at the photos, my stomach twisting. They were waiting for me. The rival faction. They had targeted me. I didn't know. "Because it is not your job to know," he snapped, stepping closer. He wasn't yelling, but the contained violence in his posture made me take a step back. "It is my job. A job I have failed once before. I will not fail it again." So he was talking about his sister. The fear in his eyes, I realized with a shock, was for me. He had almost lost me, and the thought had shattered his composure. He saw her ghost in my place. In that moment, he wasn't just a cold, calculating monster. He was a man terrified of repeating his past. The balance of power had shifted. I now knew his secret weakness, and he knew I was a target. This knowledge became our new language. A few days later, Mr. Park brought another man to the house. Not a rival, but a traitor from their own ranks. The interrogation was shorter this time, more brutal. The man broke quickly, giving up everything he knew about the rival boss, a man named Choi. Choi's weakness, the traitor revealed, was his daughter, a university student, completely uninvolved in her father's business. Mr. Kwon began to formulate a plan, a cold, ruthless strategy to use the innocent girl as leverage. I overheard it from the hallway, my blood running cold. This was a line I couldn't watch them cross. Later, as the traitor was being moved from the cellar, our paths crossed in a deserted corridor. He was bruised, but his eyes were sharp with desperation. He recognized me from the other interrogation. "Help me," he whispered, grabbing my arm. "I can get you out. You and your brother. I have money offshore. Choi will protect you. An escape. A real one. For me and Caleb." It was everything I should have wanted. But I looked at his desperate face and saw only another trap. I thought of Choi's innocent daughter. I thought of the men waiting for me at the bus stop. I thought of Caleb and how their reach could so easily extend to him. "What else do you know about Choi?" I asked, my voice steady. He hesitated, then spilled a secret. Choi had a deep-seated hatred for his own second-in-command, believing the man was secretly plotting with Mr. Kwon. It was a paranoia, but a potent one. I pulled away from him. I didn't take his offer. Instead, I went straight to Mr. Kwon's study. I told him what the traitor had offered me. Then I told him about Choi's paranoia, but I added a lie, a small, vicious detail of my own invention. I told him the traitor claimed Choi's second-in-command had been the one to leak the daughter's location. I had just handed Mr. Kwon a weapon to turn his enemy's entire organization against itself, ensuring the fallout would be catastrophic and bloody. I had crossed a moral line from which there was no return. I had chosen a side. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. He knew I had lied. He knew I had twisted the information. He knew what I had just done. He found me later that night. I was standing by the massive window in the main hall, watching the lights of Seoul glitter like a field of fallen stars. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet from behind me. I didn't turn around. "Because they came for me," I said, my reflection pale in the dark glass. "Because if they could find me, they could find my brother. In your world, you don't leave threats alive. You taught me that." I felt him move closer, his presence a warm weight at my back. "You are not part of my world, Chloe." Finally, I turned to face him. I looked him directly in the eye. All my fear and defiance, and 1,000 other unnamed emotions laid bare. "You brought me into it the moment you refused to let me leave for a date. The honesty of it hung between us, sharp and dangerous." He took the final step, closing the space between us. He raised a hand and gently, almost hesitantly, touched my face. His thumb stroked my cheekbone, a shockingly tender gesture from a man whose hands were instruments of violence. The callous skin was a stark contrast to the softness of the touch. "I am beginning to think," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "that was the first intelligent decision I have made in years." The confession was not of love. It was something far more potent, more dangerous. It was an admission of a connection neither of us had sought but both of us now acknowledged. The next morning, a package arrived. It was a small, square box, wrapped in brown paper, addressed to me. Mr. Park brought it to the study, his face grim. Mr. Kwan took it, his movements precise, as he sliced it open with a letter opener. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a dead bird, a small, blue songbird. I gasped, a hand flying to my mouth. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. When I was a little girl after my father left, my mother told me that bluebirds were signs of hope. We'd had a small ceramic one she kept on the kitchen windowsill. It was our secret, a secret no one could possibly know. Except it was in my file, the one I'd found in his desk. My history, my life. Kwan knew, and now Choi knew, too. They weren't just targeting the maid anymore. They were targeting me, my past, my hopes. They saw me as his weakness, and they were going to tear me apart to get to him. The final confrontation happened a week later. Choi, enraged and cornered by the internal strife I had helped create, made a desperate, all-or-nothing move. Mr. Kwan was holding a high-stakes parley with another family at a neutral site, the private dining room of a Michelin-starred restaurant in Gangnam. I was there, officially to serve tea, but in reality, because he refused to let me out of his sight. The attack was sudden and brutal. The windows of the private room imploded, and men in black tactical gear poured in, guns blazing. Mr. Kwan's men reacted instantly, flipping the heavy mahogany table for cover. The air filled with the roar of gunfire and the smell of plaster dust. Mr. Kwan pushed me to the floor behind the table, his body shielding mine. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in my ear as he returned fire with a pistol that had appeared in his hand as if from nowhere. But they weren't just trying to kill him. I saw it in their movements. 2 of the attackers were trying to flank us, their goal clear. They weren't aiming for a kill shot on Mr. Kwan. They were coming for me. Panic gave way to a strange, cold clarity. I was not he. I would not be the girl he failed to protect. I would not be a ghost that haunted him. I remembered the restaurant blueprints Mr. Kwan had been studying for days before the meeting. I'd seen them on his desk, my eidetic memory absorbing the layout without even trying. The kitchen. There was a main gas line running behind the industrial stoves. While he was pinned down in a furious exchange of fire, I crawled away from him, my movements small and silent under the cover of the noise. He shot me a furious look, but I was already moving. I slipped through a service door into the chaos of the kitchen. Chefs and staff were screaming, hiding. I ignored them. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, heavy, solid steel. I found the gas line, a thick copper pipe. With strength born of pure adrenaline, I swung the extinguisher, smashing it against the main valve. It took 3 tries, my arms screaming in protest, but on the 3rd hit, the valve sheared. Gas hissed violently into the air, a thick, disorienting cloud. I scrambled back out, shouting, "Gas!" The effect was immediate. The attackers, momentarily blinded and confused by the hissing cloud and the threat of an explosion, hesitated. That hesitation was all Mr. Kwan's men needed. They surged forward, overwhelming the disorganized enemy in a final, lethal wave of violence. It was over. In the ringing silence that followed, choked by the smell of gas and cordite, he found me. I was slumped against a wall in the ruined kitchen, the heavy extinguisher on the floor beside me. He was covered in dust, a cut bleeding freely above his eyebrow, but his eyes were blazing. He didn't speak. He strode across the room, pulled me to my feet, and crushed me against him. His arms wrapped around me, a grip that was both possessive and protective, absolute. "They came for you," he said, his voice rough against my hair. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, a confession of what he stood to lose. And a promise. Never again. The cost of that promise was paid in blood. Mr. Park, his stoic, loyal head of security for over 20 years, had taken 2 bullets meant for his boss. He didn't survive the ambulance ride. The victory was ashes in our mouths. In the sterile quiet of the hospital waiting room, I saw the mask of the unfeeling boss crumble. I saw Kwon Jinwoo, the man, grieving the loss of one of his only true family members. And I saw that this world, his world, always extracted a price. Weeks passed. The mansion was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, but waiting. I no longer wore the dark blue uniform. It had been burned along with the memories of that night. I stood by the window in his study, wearing a simple black dress, watching the first snow of winter begin to fall over Seoul. The white orchid on his desk was in full, perfect bloom. He entered the room without a sound. He came to stand behind me, so close I could feel the heat of his body. He didn't ask if I was staying. He didn't need to. My presence here, in his sanctum, was the answer. He had seen the file. He knew I had a brother, a life I could have run back to. He knew I had every reason to leave, but I was still here. He placed a hand on the small of my back. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement, a quiet, undeniable claim. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I leaned back into his touch, a silent acceptance of the impossible truth. I had walked into this house a ghost, a girl desperate to be invisible. I had survived fire and blood, and in the process, I had become the one thing this man, this empire, could not bear to lose. This world was lethal and cold, but here, in the heart of the danger, I was finally, irrevocably, seen.